Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Johnny Delivers is a brand new book from a author that's on his fourth book. Wayne Ning is his name, and he's joined us today. Wayne, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
So Johnny Delivers released just a couple of weeks ago, and you're already getting good reviews, I understand.
Yeah, the Globe and Mail had it on its strong recommendation list for their fall mystery reads, and I have a number of other publications, trade publications that have been coming in with just glowing praise. So yeah, I think it's going to have some legs.
Excellent. And it's got something to do with Bruce Lee, I understand?
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think you and I are of similar vintage. We both had our teenage years in the 70s.
Yep.
And he was a big dude back then.
Sure was.
So yeah, he was an iconic figure, and he still is. I mean, no offense to Jackie Chan, Michelle Yeoh, or Ali Wong, but I think Bruce Lee is still the most recognizable Asian on the planet. He was and still is a global phenomenon, and he had a huge impact on me in the 70s. And I wanted him to be a part of this novel because he was such a fixture in pop culture back then. I mean, he revolutionized the martial arts genre, and he did something for Asians that nobody else has been able to do. And he just built bridges between the East and West. He kicked ass, and he was a fantastic role model for so many of us. He's human, and I wanted his presence in the story, not just to have my 18-year-old protagonist just hero worship him, because that's very one-dimensional. Bruce was very much a human being. So part of Johnny's journey is understanding that the world isn't black and white. There's a lot of grayscale in between. He's 18 and he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. And one of the main characters is Bruce Lee, who actually died 4 years prior to the story taking place. But Johnny Wong conjures up Bruce Lee anytime he's messed up, in a fix, stressed, and just confused about things. So Bruce often pops in, and they have a journey together. Because
Fascinating. It sounds interesting.
Well, Bruce, he died young and tragically, as did his son. His daughter, Shannon, carries the memory and the spirit through the Bruce Lee Foundation. But, Bruce could have done so much more. But like for somebody who didn't live very long, he had and continues to have a huge imprint. So he did on me, and he continues, to have that influence on a lot of other people. So I wanted to explore that. But I had some rough times with Bruce as well.
Why?
And I wanted to work that through in the novel.
Rough times, why?
Well, so until Bruce came along, most depictions of Asians were pretty offensive and insulting. The humble, meek caricatures. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then Bruce comes along. It's a completely different kind of dude. He kicks ass. He does things his way. He did things his way in the movies, and he did things his way in real life. And I mean, he had a white American wife, which was unheard of. It was actually illegal back then.
It was illegal.
Oh yeah, it was illegal until the 60s. I mean, it was happening. Interracial marriages were happening. And I don't know how much prosecution took place in the States, but it was technically illegal in many states, such as where Bruce met Linda. So just knowing that Bruce was able to bridge those divides, interracial marriage, he was able to make films and get into American TV, he was doing different kinds of roles. That was huge for us. Yeah, where it became problematic for me, Brian, was, so Bruce, he kicks one narrative of Asians being docile, humble, meek. He kicks that out the window a little bit, and he creates another one. He creates this hyper-masculinity of Asian men, as if we're all born with the Kung Fu gene. So I had all sorts of guys who wanted to take me down, which wasn't hard to do. Yeah. Well into my teens, like people loved Bruce Lee. People watched his movies, and he inadvertently created this stereotype that Asians were fighters. And I don't know any Asians who could fight like Bruce Lee. I don't know anybody who could, period, right? But so he created another narrative about Asians, which is a whole lot better than the first one, but it was just as
Still
difficult.
still a
Yeah,
narrative.
yeah, yeah. It was still difficult to carry. Brian, it's as if the one singular narrative of women was that they belonged in the kitchen with an apron. All right. It's deeply narrow, myopic, and then somebody comes along and creates another narrative that, they're size two, big boobs, and they're heroines and they kick ass, right? It's kind of nice, it's fun, it's fresh, but it's equally unattainable and equally unrealistic. So that's kind of what Bruce did for us. His life is still a net gain, but when I was going through the 70s and living through racism, that didn't help me. And I think it was well into my adulthood before I understood that Bruce Lee was a lot more than a fighting machine, that I really got to appreciate him.
Right.
So
What
and
were the 70s in Toronto like for you?
so I didn't enjoy my teenage years. I know there's a lot of romanticism about adolescence. I don't know what it was like for you, Brian. But so I went to Central Tech, which at one point was the largest high school in Canada. I think there was upwards of 3,000 students there. And it was a technical and trade type school. And it was mostly dudes, all right? Mostly immigrant dudes, very working class. Um, it was awful to be a female there, I'm sure, for some, because females, they were instructed not go in certain stairways, and a lot of safety measures, which none of us guys had to deal with. So, but from a guy perspective, there was this hyper masculine culture there, which I could never live up to. And then you throw in the Bruce Lee facade, and so I felt like I was getting slammed two ways. So the 70s was not a fun time, but I think for a lot of adolescents, it's the time of when you think back, the memory and the pull of nostalgia to your teen years, even if they weren't great, there's something about that because developmentally, socially, hormonally, there's so many things going on. It's such an intense period. There's no other phase in our lives where so much is going on, where so much change takes place in such a short, concentrated period.
You're coming into terms with who you are.
Yeah, I mean, it takes more than teens to do that because we're constantly evolving, Brian, but our bodies are changing too, right? We're making life changes. Our social grouping is changing repeatedly. We're switching schools. We're making major decisions. There isn't any other time where we have to go through the conflicts of that. So it was, and my parents had issues, and my parents had health issues. So it was a challenging time. And I wanted to capture that in Johnny Delivers. Like, he's 18 in the novel. He's good at two things: looking after his family and running the family restaurant. And one of the through lines in Johnny Delivers is growing up too fast and standing up to your parents and having the courage to look after them at the same time because the family's under threat. So Johnny's good at looking after the family. And then he finds out that his sweet but treacherous auntie, the Mahjong queen, is calling in the family debt. So Johnny swings into action. He's gonna look after the family, and he invokes the spirit of his imaginary friend Bruce Lee. And he taps on his buddy Barry, who's a stoner friend that he's known for many years. And they concoct a scheme to save the family restaurant. They don't tell the parents this. They're going to sell weed. They're going to use the restaurant as a drug depot, and they're going to deliver egg rolls with a side of weed. It sounds harebrained, right? But he does really well, Brian. He makes money, starts paying down the debt. He starts getting popular at school because he's pushing weed. He has this swagger, he even has the courage to ask out the girl of his dreams. And then all of a sudden the bottom falls out. Chinatown gangs move in. His sister gets caught stealing some of Johnny's drugs, and she gets busted for possession. His parents start asking questions. The auntie starts asking questions, and then Barry disappears. So like Johnny's struggling to hold everything together, family secrets pop out of nowhere, and it all builds towards this epic winner-take-all mahjong game where everything's on the line. So the craziness of my adolescence, the insecurity, the confusion, the need to look for a hero, I try and synthesize some of that in Johnny Delivers.
Sounds fantastic. What a great overview of the novel. Thank you so much. We're chatting with Wayne Ning about his book that's just been released called Johnny Delivers. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Wayne Ning. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Wayne Ning is my guest tonight. He's an author. His fourth novel, his fourth book has just been released. It's called Johnny Delivers, and it sounds like a really interesting book. Wayne, I understand that part of it has a reference to married bachelor societies in Chinatown. What the heck's that?
Yeah, I have to put this in the context, and I can't answer that without some really interesting Chinese history. So, as you know, imported Chinese labor was instrumental in building the railroad. You know, especially the most difficult sections in BC, they got half the wages, all right? And once that was done in the 1880s, there were thousands of Chinese left behind. The Canadian governments and society, they weren't shy about telling the Chinese to go home and restricting further Chinese immigration. It didn't stop it. Chinese continued to come, communities continued to thrive, but the Canadian government dug in. They put up head taxes, Exclusion Act, they had segregation, they restricted Chinese from buying property, working certain jobs, even hiring white women for their businesses. Like it just went on and on and on. Eventually, with the Exclusion Act, they shut the door on further immigration, leaving a society of mostly male bachelors, married male bachelors left behind. It got to the point where there were about 28 married bachelors, males, to every female. If you know, like you can
With
imagine,
their wives back in China.
that's right. They couldn't bring them over, and it was very difficult to go back home. So many of them, including my grandfather, who came in 1911, paid the $500 head tax, which is like $18,000 in today's dollars. You know, they were left behind, alone, incredibly miserable and lonely. And they became a society of married bachelors. So that's where that term comes from.
And what did they do?
Well, I think
Play mahjong?
like some of them played mahjong. They did what they needed to do to survive and to get by. So in the face of racist laws, which limited where they could live, limited where they could work, and limited their mobility, they created Chinatowns, where they could live, where they could own property. And within the Chinatowns, they created something called tongs, also known as associations, or think of a benevolent society or Freemasons. So, and most of them were clan-based, Brian. So there would be a Crombie association, an Ing association, a Wong association, a Chu, a Sito. And within these associations, yeah, they played mahjong, they gambled, but they sipped tea, they read newspapers, they hung, they passed messages. Some of them acted as advocacy and speaking for, to local governments. They basically provided settlement services and, self-directed, self-funded welfare. And this is something that they all did among themselves. And they created their own collectives, is what they
And that's
did.
what created the Chinatowns.
Well, the associations were part of Chinatowns. The Chinatowns were socially the only acceptable place that the Chinese could live.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I understand that the book is dedicated to paper families and their untold stories. What and who are paper families?
Yeah, so paper families, to put it succinctly, are illegals. Okay, so, Canada has a very generous history of immigration. Remember in high school, we studied how the Alberta and Saskatchewan government, they gave out 150 acres to Europeans so that they could fill out the province in the early 1900s. we've been very generous to Ukrainian refugees recently, East Europeans who came out of the former Yugoslavia. And when I was studying immigration, the most, the largest group of illegals in Canada, Brian, were, and this will surprise you because it'll surprise me, were Americans. Okay.
Really?
Yeah, nobody said anything about that because we cherry pick, what groups of people we want to come in. We cherry pick whether we want to turn a blind eye or we want to put them under a microscope. So if these Americans were trying to get through Roxham and they were Roxham Road, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. And if they were white, we might have reacted differently. Okay. So the paper families that you're asking me about were Chinese illegals. They were, but they were never recipients of the generosity of Canadian governments when it came to immigration. They had the head taxes, they had the Exclusion Acts. And then when the Exclusion Act ended in 47, Chinese immigration was allowed. Okay, but they had to be immediate family of Canadian citizens, Chinese Canadian citizens. Okay. There were a lot of Chinese, there were a lot of Chinese in China with family in Canada who didn't have documents. So they had to buy documents. And there were a lot of Chinese who wanted to come to Canada who paid their way with false ID. So my mother was one of them. I have an uncle who's one of them who they want to come to Canada. They can't get in through any other means. They're not white Americans. They're not Europeans where the carpet is just being rolled out. They're Chinese, the only group that had these kinds of laws and measures historically. So they bought ID pretending to come in under, pretending to be the daughter of so-and-so or the wife of so-and-so. And thousands came in this way, Brian, and it got to the point where in the 60s, the Canadian government offered amnesty. And a lot of Canadians stepped forward and said, yeah, they came clean with that. But a lot of Chinese Canadians didn't because they have historically been fearful and mistrusting of Canadian governments. They expected that they would be deported, even though the Canadian government said it's an amnesty. It's all going to be good. But you have to understand that in 23, when the Exclusion Act happened, Chinese were the only group that had to walk around with identity cards, with photo ID. And that's how restrictive and draconian it was. So there was very little trust. There was a strong desire to remain in Canada. There was a strong desire to come to Canada, to build life here. But there wasn't the welcoming, there wasn't the sense of stability, there wasn't trust between the early immigrants and the Canadian governments. So yeah, all that to say is paper families were Chinese Canadians who came in under false IDs or yeah.
Sounds like a lot of Johnny Delivers is about you and your family history. Is most of Johnny Delivers actually Wayne Ning?
It's a work of fiction, Brian, but I think every writer, they circle around certain themes or settings. You know how Stephen King loves to write stories set in Maine. One of the authors I like, Celeste Ng, loves family dramas. And, I think the DNA that I circle around, the themes that I circle around, the stories I like to circle around is reclaiming your identity, family secrets, sordid family secrets. Like there's a lot of silence and secrets that permeates my family because we didn't like talking about paper families. We didn't like talking about the hard times. We just swallowed and moved on. And I think that's ultimately unhealthy, Brian. So I address that head on in a number of my books. But Brian, I was surrounded by a lot of weed when I was a teenager. I didn't deal it. I smoked drugs, but I didn't inhale, okay? That's a joke.
Somebody famous said that.
Yeah. But many of the settings very much are based on my adolescence. Like it takes place in Central Tech, Kensington, Chinatown. Yonge Street's a big part of this as well. because I don't know if you were anywhere in Ontario in the 70s, but Yonge Street was just a magnet. I'm sure they could see it from outer space. It was just the seediest strip in North America. It was just Sex City. Yeah, there were so many head shops, strip joints, dark little theaters. It was such a magnet for a lot of people, and yeah, so that forms one of the backdrops. So and struggles that I had with my parents, the cultural, generational, and linguistic conflicts that we had, which aren't unusual with a lot of immigrants, are detailed here as well. I talk about the paper families, I talk about the historical stuff, but it's not about. I don't spend a lot of time in the history. I plant it in
Yep.
because it's ultimately about an 18-year-old who wants to move on with his life and how he does that, whether it's with Bruce Lee or heroes and villains who out of nowhere pop into his life.
Does including part of you and your own history and your family history make the book easier to write or more difficult to write?
Well, some writers are really, they insist that they write from a fairly objective, almost journalistic, observational approach, so that they're quite removed from their work. I prefer to inhabit my characters. I prefer to really feel my way in, and I always start with characters and I start with themes. So, the book before Johnny Delivers was actually called Letters from Johnny, so that both books are standalone sequels, and Letters from Johnny is the same character, similar DNA, but I did really well with the first book. It actually won Best Crime Novella in Canada a couple years back, and it was,
Congratulations.
yeah, thanks. It was Ottawa Book Award finalist as well. So I thought it would be easy writing a standalone sequel. It was unplanned, but my publisher, it sold really well for him. So I have the same character, I have the same setting. It should be really easy. All I have to do is create a different time period because I don't want to write about an 11-year-old boy again. So I create Johnny Wong as an 18-year-old. And you think just if the source material is yourself, you don't have to do a lot of research. You just need to look inward. It should be easy, right, Brian?
What do you want to accomplish by writing Johnny Delivers?
Well, I wanted to, by writing these novels, I needed to work through several things. So part of this better answers your last question in that because the novel was hard to write, Brian, because I had to look inward, because I had to peel away layers and do some family research, it was a great opportunity for me to grow. It was a great opportunity for me to just sort of clean up some baggage from the 70s because race and poverty were such big issues, and it was nice to revisit my adolescence and, those periods that weren't so great and just sort of reclaim them. So in writing this, I got to do that. I got to create a romp that was really fun. I got to create a story where the readers are going to have a better appreciation of the struggles and the shadows that many immigrant families had, and experienced when they got to Canada as they were trying to build lives. So, I want to grow in my writing, Brian. Sure, we all want Netflix deals. Yeah, we all want to be top at the bestseller list, but ultimately I write for myself first. But secondly, I do want the readers to be entertained. And I think I do that. I'm so confident of that, Brian, that you go out and get the book, you buy it, and if you don't like it, I'm going to send you your money back. All right. How many authors offer you that, Brian? But I'm doing that. I've
Well, it
got that
sounds
on the
like a
record.
fascinating book and a fascinating read and a great story. And so I'm looking forward to reading it. Walter, Wayne, Ning, thank you so much for joining us and telling us about where can we get the book?
Well, the book can be bought or borrowed wherever books are bought and sold, whether it's your favorite indie bookstore, preferably. The big evil conglomerates, Indigo, Amazon. You can borrow if you're not in a position to buy. I believe the Toronto Public Library system has a number of copies, but it's also a long wait list there. because it is catching on. I'm not sure what Mississauga Public Library has, but yeah, wherever fine books are sold and borrowed.
Wing Ning, thanks so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about Johnny Delivers. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Sounds like a great story and some history
Yeah,
that
yeah,
probably not everyone is familiar with, and so probably important for us to be more aware of it. And
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
given frankly what's happening in the United States today, and the comments about mass deportations, and
yeah.
trying to identify all the illegal aliens in the United States. Probably there's some similarities to some of the things that you've described that were happening in the early 1900s in Canada, and it'll be interesting to see. And someone's going to be writing some stories about that, I presume. So it'll be a good read. I'm looking forward to reading it, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break and come back with another author in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.